Welcome to Mai Ling Speaks. As an essential part of Mai Ling Speaks, we attempt to connect active voices around the world that are dealing with the anti-Asian ramification of these exceptional times. Today, we are really happy to have the New York-based artist Kenneth Tam to talk about his project We Are Not COVID. We Are Not COVID started as a spreadsheet intended to be one record of the current anti-Asian incidents in the US. Recently, Kenneth also starts a campaign called StopDiscriminAsian together with a group of Asian American artists and curators.
StopDiscriminAsian is a coalition of workers within arts and culture who are confronting the racism, xenophobia, and violence towards diasporic Asians that have been amplified by the COVID-19 pandemic. SDA seeks to expand awareness through the galvanization of individual voices in solidarity with other marginalized communities, to expose and subvert the systemic racism and economic injustice exacerbated by this unprecedented moment of global emergency. So, Kenneth, our first question is, can you tell me about how you got started with We Are Not COVID?
Sure, and thank you for inviting me to speak with you, you all, your collective. So the spreadsheet started very simply and almost kind of innocently. I was speaking to a friend who lives in the same part of Brooklyn that I do, and she told me about some incidents that happened to her. And I was aware, things have been happening all over the country, all over the world for a number of months now, but I didn't know anyone, or I didn't know anyone who had something happen to them personally, and also so close to where I live. And so once she told me her story, and she endured a number of incidents, it wasn't just one, I immediately just thought that there should be some kind of open record of all these events, that I knew that people would probably be sharing them anecdotally between friends and family, but that they were probably not going to circulate beyond that. People were not going to hear about these stories otherwise, right? It's just something that people tend to do, is to kind of keep these things to themselves because of shame, embarrassment. And so a spreadsheet or some sort of collective document seemed like a good response, some way to archive and circulate these stories beyond just the anecdotal, or even if they were very small incidents that somehow if you saw a whole document full of them, it would feel very differently. They would have a different kind of weight and urgency to it. And it might even, validate some people who might otherwise minimize their experiences. And also just to build awareness by circulating this document, even if you have nothing to contribute, you become aware. You are sort of complicit in this, right? Like you are no longer sort of oblivious to what's happening. A reader becomes activated in some way. So I and there was also, I was inspired by a number of other sort of spreadsheets that have been circulating. I'm not sure if you're aware of these, but there was one that was circulating the salaries of museum workers and information sharing in that way. And also teachers were sharing their salaries, not just within the art department, but throughout academia. So there had already been a kind of trend of crowdsourcing information between communities of different organizations, let's say of labor, and I thought that a spreadsheet would make sense in this situation. So I started it about 5 or 6 weeks ago. Yeah, so I feel like I came to this relatively late because things were already happening for months before that.
My next question will be, because I read a little bit on this sheet, this spreadsheet from We Are Not COVID, and it's I found many incidents are really frightening, and that's why that I also want to quote here. For example, for one case, and just for our audience, I just read out here. This must be the case 49. which happened on 7th April. And here are two people who work at my institution were confronted by an unknown male who asked if they were Chinese or Japanese. And they say, if you are Chinese or Japanese, I'm going to kill you. The perpetrator then lifted his shirt and showed the two people a handgun in his waistband. The two people continued working with the subject following and again asking the same question. And one person then told the subject they were here to help and work at the hospital. And at this moment, the subject said, "Oh, you are here to help." The subject then held out his fist and bumped it against the affiliated, turned and walked away. So this is one of the case it just jumped to my eyes and I found really quite heavy. And my question will be to you what do you or rather the SDA plan to do with these records of anti-Asian incidents that you collected?
Yes, so I think right away what we've done is we've set up a website and we've used that website to display some of these entries. We got permission from some people that left their names. Most of the posts are anonymous, but some people did leave contact information. And so I reached out and asked them if they would be okay if we highlighted their incidents on our website. So you can, if you go to it, you can read some of these kind of firsthand testimonials. So we want to foreground these incidents as a way to, if you weren't already aware, this is happening, and it's happening at a sort of frightening scale, as you're the one that you just read out sort of shows you. So that's one immediate thing that we're doing with the spreadsheet. And we hope to, continue to circulate it. I think at this point, there's enough entries on it that even if people don't add to it, it functions by spreading awareness, but also galvanizing people because it's such a horrific document. I hope that you can't read that without responding in some way. And so just to have that sort of exist and be out in the world, I think can do something. So while it still is functioning, it's still open and people can continue to share. I think it's already sort of at a point where it can affect some sort of change in a reader.
Okay. Yeah, this sounds great because very similar action is also being carried out now here also in the Europe, and one of the collection we are also invited for our next interview, for example, is Koreantation, and they collect incidents, racism content of public at different media in German media. There are quite many, of course, at the moment.
Yeah, like I think there is definitely a very strong power that comes with archival work, because essentially all the reports that have been collected can be, of course, used as leverage and also proof. And also it's a documentation of history and everyday experiences, which I think is extremely valid during these times. So since the outbreak, we have all been forced in some way or another to stay at home, and it has also led to increased digitalization of things. So how do you think that the digital world can help us feel more connected, or rather to demonstrate our solidarity with all who are affected by the escalating anti-Asian xenophobia tendency?
That's an interesting question. So I think for everyone that's been spending time at home on quarantine, these digital technologies are sort of very present in our lives right now. And I also teach, so I've been forced to teach my classes on Zoom, these studio art classes over video conference, and they are problematic at best. they lack a certain sort of intimacy. You know, obviously the physicalness of teaching, that experience between students and the professors is gone. What you have is this kind of total flattening of discourse and of potential intimacy, or even potential I don't know, the warmth that comes from being around another human being is totally lost on platforms like Zoom. In terms of using it towards activism, you know, I think SDA came out of you know, real feeling and real sort of anger, but also finding ourselves with an excess amount of time. And so we were able to sort of translate that through these platforms into this thing that we've produced now. So, you know, it is interesting that it's able to very quickly gather people and share ideas and to sort of strategize. I think that's, you know, one benefit of everyone being locked inside and having time to think about things, but also, you know, consuming all this media has kind of helped fuel perhaps the urgency of what we're doing. So, you know, I think that, yeah, the platform certainly has enabled certain kinds of immediate social organizing. Whether that's sustainable or not, I don't know. But it is interesting in how quickly our response has come together, largely because of platforms like Zoom, these digital tools. I would never say that they could replace actual gathering, right? Like, I think a lot about what happens, you know, when our quarantine is ending. I think in Europe it's starting to happen a little sooner, but you know, does a digital platform replace actual activism? Can it actually function as that? I'm used to seeing, you know, people on the streets and marching. That feels like real activism. I'm not sure if this version can or should even try to substitute for that. I think there's only so much you can do from your home, from a laptop, but I could be wrong.
I would see that they have two different phases, because the politicians are using this also to manipulate, yeah, to use it also for their tool. And but principle is quite good, because also for this project that we invited different association, it helps us to keep the solidarity with other groups. And that's why we are really happy to have you here, because America is quite far away from Europe, and I think the situation is very different. Yeah, my next question will be, I think I sent you a link of an article, but it is okay if you, if you don't get the time to read, but I just want to mention it. That's an article I read a few days ago with the title "Coronavirus Fears Show How Model Minority Asian Americans Become the Yellow Peril." And I found it quite interesting, of course, because of this historical relation, of course, of yellow peril. So yellow peril is coming back now. And here in Europe, immigrants from Asian have also been considered as so-called model minority before the crisis. But actually, we found this impression already before. So before the crisis is indeed superficial, and it is very problematic, because it's already related to this kind of so stereotypical images, such as hardworking, enduring, politeness, etc. And my question to you will be, can you tell us about this so-called general perception of Asian American in the US society before the crisis, and how it has changed now?
Yeah, I mean, I did read that article. Thank you for sending it. Yeah, this is something that people grapple with all the time. It's a history. It's a legacy. It's a kind of actually kind of this very oppressive mechanism for sort of keeping Asian Americans outside of a larger discourse of seeing them as a minority group that has its own sort of struggles. I think what you described is still quite apt in this country. You know, the Asian American community is quite large and diverse. It's certainly not monolithic, but the model minority myth is a way of kind of flattening that diversity and also flattening difference and flattening even more demographic information in terms of class, income, education levels. You know, not every Asian American is able to achieve the things that the myth sort of purports we are able to do. There's, I think one statistic is that Asians make up the largest percentage of lower income minorities, I think, in the city or in New York City, I believe. I could be wrong on that, but in any case, that myth masks the fundamental inequalities and disadvantages that a lot of different groups within the larger Asian American umbrella exist under. So in terms of how Asian Americans exist in the U.S. Or even in that term, you know, Asian American already sort of refers specifically to our country. I'm not sure if there is an equivalent in Europe, but I think here that there is definitely an image of a hardworking, successful professional who typically is apolitical. Has a family, is interested in sort of maintaining a certain status quo, and also, you know, certainly benefiting from a white adjacency, but that obviously has proven to be quite false in the wake of COVID. And this is something that, you know, activists, other activists are certainly aware of. I think our group is certainly trying to do our best to dispel that myth. I think that people who are Asian American know that myth is not true, even if they sort of embody a lot of its qualities. I think that it's something that most people are actively aware of, and it's very frustrating on a day-to-day level. And you know, COVID has certainly revealed how false and how oppressive that label is, and how sort of antiquated it is, and we need to sort of work to move beyond that. I mean, you see a lot of more public Asian American figures coming through, and I'm not sure how aware you are of someone like Andrew Yang, who was a presidential candidate for a period of time, and he wrote this op-ed that got really criticized for, you know, in some ways perpetuating that myth. So even for someone that seems so aware of their position, they can still very easily fall into that trap of embodying the hardworking all-American figure that's not going to cause problems. If we just sort of inhabit or sort of embody the ideals of our country more, we can sort of escape whatever problems that come with being Asian American, that kind of attitude.
Yeah, I'm also actually interested what do you think about, because also this kind of the concept of Mai Ling, so a kind of because in Europe, so they don't really avoid about what is the difference between different nationality, for example. So if you come from China or Korean or Japan, it is actually the same thing for them, and that's why that it is not only Chinese are hardworking or model minority, but also for Japanese and Korean, all these people are actually quite the same. Is this also similar in America?
Sorry, the question was, where are all these different groups lumped together? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
I think so. I think that term does that work, right? When you say Asian American, it certainly reduces the fine differences between these various groups. And you rarely see that distinction in the media. I mean, I think people understand, people probably know the distinction based on things like food, and perhaps music, right? They know what they're getting into when they go to a Chinese restaurant versus a Korean versus a Japanese, right? I think that becomes the where that distinction is most felt and important. I don't know if it necessarily translates beyond that in cultural terms or historical terms. Um, but um, but at the same time, I think there is, at least in this country, a greater awareness that these groups even exist. But again, you know, Asian American as is a kind of a problematic term. It certainly reduces a lot of the difference, and it masks a lot of the finer, you know, issues that exist between communities, like class, like education levels, right? But it's a term that we have, and you know, we use it as best as we can, I suppose. But I'm curious, you know, like how do Asians in Europe define themselves, or is there a particular a label or larger demographic term that is used?
So, like I would agree in many instances that there is very much the similarities in terms of this homogenization of, you know, different cultures and different countries into this one, you know, symbol of the sense of Asianness, and that is so much transported just based on appearances, I find. And also often, because you also talked a lot about this sort of embodiment of that model minority, and I see that very often with, for example, Chinese or Asian diaspora in Austria, for example, that they would embody a lot of these stereotypes. And I see that in the sense that they use it as a type of survival mechanism in order to blend blend into white society, or almost perform whiteness to a certain extent. And I find this extremely problematic in the way that the humor is being used, such as the one that was presented in OIF through this, you know, Gute Nacht Österreich show that we were protesting against, but also in a lot of everyday instances on how, you know, humor is being used to lighten certain racial situations, and is very much used as a form of survival mechanism in a predominantly white society. This is also transported a lot through food. So we've been working on this one project that is investigating how in the German-speaking world, how food is being represents a lot of different cultures. And we don't, here it's actually quite homogenized in the sense that you would go to, for example, a Chinese restaurant, but they will serve Japanese food, Korean food, Chinese food, and that would all be in the same menu, and also Thai food. And this I find quite unusual, because in Sydney, which is where I come from, there will be a very defined distinction between the different cuisines, whereas here it's very much mixed. So this is a lot of this research that we've been investigating, like, and sort of asking ourselves why and in which point in time did this come about, and also like interviewing some of these restaurant owners in terms of, you know, because they also come from very different backgrounds, and why they've decided themselves to introduce, you know, these different cuisines into their menus, although it does not reflect their own culture. So this I find extremely interesting, also very symbolic of the Germanic context. And of course, there are also a lot of interesting dishes that have evolved from Chinese cuisine, for example, into a Germanic context as a way to adapt to the tastes of, you know, white people. Just moving forward, because I think we might be running out of time. So I just want to go sort of coming back into the US context, how is actually the current situation with COVID-19 at the moment? Like, aside from spontaneous organizations and platforms run by individuals, what is the current response from the US government regarding the wave of anti-Asian sentiment?
Well, if you're talking the the national government, they are probably making it worse. They are probably, you know, I don't know if you're aware of some of the controversies around Trump pushing to call it the Chinese virus, the Wuhan virus. That has certainly exacerbated the problem. On a more local level, it's quite different from state to state, city to city. I'm aware of small task forces being set up, which are just, I think, specialized groups within specialized sort of investigative groups within law enforcement that are looking at this rise in hate crimes. But the problem is that a lot of people continue to not report these incidents. A lot of the incidents, as you can see from the spreadsheet, are also quite fleeting, right? These are kind of things that would not amount to a more sort of textbook definition of what a hate crime is. So they cannot be prosecuted or investigated by the police. So you have the problem where even if it does rise to that level, many people are not coming forward. I think it's a very cultural phenomenon where people are keeping this to themselves or not sharing it for a variety of reasons. So even if the problem was more visible in terms of for law enforcement, I think there's very little that they can actually do. I read some statistic where in all of New York City, you know, a large metropolitan area, they only have 10 active hate crime cases currently open from January to the present day. And that is, you know, just an incredibly small number given how many incidents are actually occurring day to day. So even if we were to put our faith in law enforcement to handle this, they're barely tackling the problem. So so the government response, there is one, but it's just not really there in terms of capacity to serve and to deal with the much larger issue that's happening. You know, you're probably very aware that our our national response to COVID is a complete disaster, and so every state, every city has a lot on their hands, particularly New York City, which is the epicenter of COVID at this point in the US. So I think the problem is, yeah, there is a sort of visibility issue. And also, well, with all these things that are happening right now, where does this kind of fall in the pecking order? And unfortunately, it gets pushed quite far down. So I think that's why you see these groups that are mobilizing on their own as a response to fill this vacuum and trying to draw more awareness to the issue at hand, because the government is not in any way prepared to deal with it in a significant way.
And do you have the feeling, because of this or this talk of Trump about this Wuhan virus or China virus, does his behavior influence this wave of anti-Asian sentiment?
I mean, I can't help but see why there wouldn't be a connection between what he's saying and how people are feeling. I don't think that. To be honest, I don't think Trump even really cares about Asian Americans. Like, not necessarily in a bad way. He's just not. That's just not on his radar. You know, anything that doesn't help him get reelected is not. He has no room for that in his mind, right? So, I don't think Asian Americans make up enough of the electorate for it to matter to him. He's much more concerned about his base of supporters, and he'll say anything it takes. Do anything it takes to energize them. So if that involves creating a neat little scapegoat, then so be it. It doesn't really matter who that target is. And then, you know, you see these other stories where they're trying to continue to blame China and trying to find ways to drum up nationalist, nativist sentiments as a way of trying to bolster his position towards the upcoming election. And I think that Asian Americans are just a kind of unfortunate bystander in terms of his behavior anyway. But the way in which we sort of exist in a more sort of national consciousness is much more complicated. I think there's historically been a lot of xenophobia within American culture, and I think the way that Asians exist within the popular imagination lines up very nicely with this kind of xenophobia and the way that we in this country in general has constantly looked for scapegoats and constantly sought to define the other and use that group as a convenient excuse for whatever is happening at the current moment. Every crisis requires a scapegoat.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, great. Thank you. And Gianna, do you have something to?
No, I think this actually really sums up a lot of the things that have been sort of on our minds, and I think now it's even more important, that we've basically been, the bystander of this whole situation, and we're constantly trying to find ways to raise our voices and use artistic means to do that. And I think as a way to sort of build alliances and find solidarity, it becomes even more important now that, we reach out and we find ways to influence mainstream media and sort of get our standing and put our foot in, especially in these times of crisis where we're not really in the top agenda. We're not very much in priority at the moment. But like for me, it becomes even more important to actually discuss these issues and to bring that onto the table, because now is the time to really critically question, essentially, for example, how the media is portraying, racism, or how it's constantly reusing certain language that perpetuates racism, or how they're also reporting on racism as well. And I find your project extremely encapsulating in the sense that it finds a way to archive and collect day-to-day stories and raise awareness through that collection, be it large or small, but it definitely creates impact, and it's also has a certain level of reach, of course, because we also encountered this project almost by chance, so to say, like through friends of friends sending it to us. And I think I'm really happy to meet you and to have this conversation, and I hope that we can find ways to sort of continue this activism, archiving, whatever we want to call it, and find some way to sort of have a stronger say in this whole crisis.
For sure, because I've had a number of reporters or investigators or even sociology students, let's say, who have kind of come upon the document, and they found it helpful in that way, right? So people are actively trying to document the moment. People are actively trying to accumulate or understand, the history of the moment as it's happening. And I think, the spreadsheet, at the very least, can sort of find its way into the larger history of what is happening, right? Or you cannot tell the story of COVID without this aspect of the epidemic. There's two epidemics happening, right? There's the actual biological virus, and then there's one that is based on racism.
Absolutely.
And these things they're totally intertwined. And I think, our group came together also because we understand that, or we predict that once we are out of lockdown, once the major metropolitan areas come out of this quarantine, things are only going to get worse. right? That once people are actually encountering each other day to day in more sort of direct physical means, and you have the people are much more distressed, perhaps emotionally, financially, they're going to continue this behavior. They will continue to sort of seek easy sort of scapegoats to vent, and we're trying to prepare for that inevitability. So I feel like the work, we've done the easy part. It's only going to sort of exacerbate in the coming months. So I'm not sure if it's interesting to see, if you are experiencing something similar, because, your countries are a few months ahead of us, and whether that prediction will come true in other parts of the world, but we're certainly anticipating that here.
Okay, I thank you everyone to watch this interview, and thank you again Kenneth, to join us and give us this very fruitful interview. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.